Hey, welcome back, Push Kids. We're here for our next lecture, 2.6, Slavery in the British Colonies, here in AP US History. Today, we actually have two different essential questions that we're going to be tackling today, both of them fairly quickly. Our first one is explain the causes and effects of slavery in the various British colonial regions. Our second one, 2G, says explain how enslaved people responded to slavery. So, to tackle our first one, the causes and effects of slavery in the British colonial regions, we want to look at key idea number one. And this is pretty simple. All British colonies participated to varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade. And so this is pretty simple. Everybody did. All 13 colonies. This is once again kind of another misconception I think that a lot of us have. We oftentimes just think of slavery as being from essentially like Virginia, maybe Maryland, to the south, but everybody is involved. So everybody's involved in this type of thing. All right. There are regional differences that do lead to some long-term divisions between northern and southern colonies, but everybody is involved. So let's kind of start off in the South. I mean, we do see that slavery was much more common in the South than it was in northern colonies. You know, of those southern slaves, most of them were field workers, mostly on plantations. About somewhere between 10 to 20% were working in other fields, either in dockyards, working on ships, repairing ships, doing things like that, or working in slave masters' houses. But we see, just based on the chart there, you can see that, for instance, Massachusetts, only 2% of the population in 1750 was black, whereas in Virginia and South Carolina, it was 44 and 60% respectively. But it still did exist in the North. And they certainly bring in a lot more as well. And slavery does continue to expand. We see between 1493 and 1600, the number of slaves that are brought over to the Americas in general is not very big. Between 1601 and 1700, it grows. And then after 1700 to 1810, it rises into the millions upon millions. Over 6 million are brought over. Now, the northern economy, by contrast, though, is much more diverse than the south. We see the farms are much smaller. They grow multiple crops, things like that. The northern economies also focus on other tasks such as lumber, shipbuilding, fishing, things like that. And so there's not as much need for large-scale agriculture that would require or need large amounts of slaves. Now, you do have big cities, and we do see slaves in some of these big international port cities. Many of them are working in either one of basically two trades. Either A, they're working in houses as personal servants, or what might be called footmen. They're also working on the dockyards. So they're working for people that work and do things with the shipping industry itself. So either building or repairing ships, or all the other things that go along with ships, whether it's ropes or sails or all the other stuff. So that's generally where we see slavery in the North, is working in those city type atmospheres. In the South, though, it's dominated by this cash crop agriculture, plantations, where we see these huge gaps between rich and poor. Slaves, indentured servants are much more likely to be there. Now, they get there first in 1619. With the first African slave ships are brought in. And then Bacon's Rebellion, as we mentioned before, is kind of the really big turning point that starts to bring in more of this bounded labor into places like Maryland and Virginia. And as we've already talked about, much of this labor is being brought over as a result of the Middle Passage. That's bringing most of these slaves over this trip from Africa to the West Indies and then into North America. That brings us then to our second major idea. Our key idea is chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many of these southern colonies. New laws create a strict racial system. So let's look at some of those laws. And so here is a list of of those laws. All right. So chattel slavery, which is slavery for life. This is different from indentured servitude, where people can get out of it after a period of 4 to 7 years. It becomes very dominant in places like Virginia and further to the south. And so some of these new laws create a very strict racial system. All right. For instance, in 1661, the institution of slavery is acknowledged in law. They ban interracial marriage. And then we also see perpetual slavery. So for instance, in Virginia in 1662, we see that slavery is an inherited condition flowing from the mother, which means that not only was the mother enslaved for life, but her children would be enslaved for life, and their children, children after them. Which brings us then to key idea number 3. Africans developed both overt and covert means to resist the dehumanizing nature of slavery and maintain their family and gender systems, culture, and religions. And so we want to look at some of those overt ways. Now, by far, the most famous of these overt, clearly seen ways of resisting was the rebellions. The Stono Rebellion was by far the most famous. 150 slaves attacked and killed about 20 whites. It was, like all slave rebellions, ultimately unsuccessful, but was the most famous rebellion of the colonial time period. Now, other ways that slaves would overtly resist is they would run away. We see that this was fairly common by the number of runaway ads that were placed in different newspapers at the particular time. They would slow down work or even sabotage equipment as well. Now, slaves also attempted to maintain their culture that they had developed. Now, many slaves were from various different cultures in Africa. And this is another important point to make sure that we understand, is that not all people from Africa are the same. They come from various different tribes in various different regions. They have different cultures. They have different languages. They come from different and varying social structures. And so very much like Native Americans, we oftentimes misconstrue Africans as being all from one group when in fact they were from hundreds, if not thousands, of different groups. But they try and maintain as best as they can some semblance of their former African cultures. We see this come about as they develop, a common music and dance are very important to maintaining African culture. And even though, you had families, oftentimes these marriages were not recognized, and planters would sometimes go out of their way to break up families that they knew about. The image that you see in the background there is a painting called Jumping the Broom, which was a common way for slaves to become married at that particular time. Now, slave religion oftentimes blended any African rituals with rituals of Christianity that they had. And so what really started to develop was a unique culture for African Americans here in the Americas. Well, that ends our lecture today on the developments in and around slavery, how it developed. Understand that it was in the North as well as in the South, though predominantly in the South, and this was due to the economic differences between North and South. Understand how slavery went to become codified or entrenched in law at this particular time, and that slaves, as best as they could, tried to maintain their culture while at the same time and periodically participating in both forms of overt and covert resistance. Until next time, go Pack.